They thought they knew everything about Jimi Hendrix, the iconic guitar god whose fingers rewrote rock history, but a chilling detail from his final hours is resurfacing, and it's forcing fans to question everything they thought they knew about his untimely death. Was it really just a tragic accident? Or is there more to the story that's been buried for decades? He didn't just play the guitar, he set it on fire, both literally and metaphorically. Jimi Hendrix was a force of nature, a once-in-a-lifetime talent who redefined what music could sound like. But behind the blazing solos and mind-bending performances, something darker was brewing. On September 18, 1970, at just 27 years old, Hendrix was found dead in a London apartment. The official cause? Asphyxiation. He choked on his own vomit after taking sleeping pills. Tragic, yes. Open and shut? Not even close. More than 5 decades later, whispers that never fully went away are now getting louder. Cryptic remarks from people close to Hendrix, buried interviews, inconsistencies in medical reports, tiny cracks in the story that once seemed airtight are beginning to split wide open. And here's where things start to feel less like a sad accident and more like a rock and roll conspiracy no one wanted to believe. Because what if Jimi Hendrix didn't just die that night? What if he was silenced? At the time, the world accepted the explanation because they had no choice. The loss was so staggering, so gut-wrenching, that the easiest thing was to grieve, move on, and mythologize the man who burned so brightly he couldn't possibly last. But now, after years of silence and scattered clues, a disturbing theory is making a comeback. And it's not just internet rumor. There's a reason Hendrix's name still surfaces in hushed tones when people talk about music industry cover-ups, or about the so-called 27 Club, that eerie collection of stars who all died too young under murky circumstances. There are documents, witness accounts, confessions, even people claiming to know why he was a threat, and who may have wanted him gone. This is more than a tragic rock star tale. This is a puzzle with missing pieces that have finally started turning up in the most unexpected places. And if the picture they form is real, we may need to rethink everything we know about how Jimi Hendrix really left this world. To understand what really happened to Jimi Hendrix, we have to go back, not just to the night he died, but to the final stretch of his life, when the cracks began to show beneath the surface of his larger-than-life persona. By 1970, Jimi Hendrix was exhausted. From the outside, he seemed unstoppable. He was headlining massive festivals, selling out arenas, and being hailed as the greatest guitarist of his generation, possibly of all time. But offstage, he was worn thin. Strung between tour dates, contract disputes, legal battles, and the suffocating pressure of being a black man in a white-dominated rock world that both worshipped and exploited him, Hendrix was spiraling in slow motion. His inner circle noticed the shift. Friends said he seemed distant, distracted, even paranoid. In interviews, he sounded increasingly philosophical, occasionally cryptic, talking about death, feeling trapped, and wanting to disappear from the public eye. And then there was the music. His new songs hinted at something deeper. He wasn't chasing chart toppers anymore. He was chasing something raw, real, maybe even redemptive. He was planning a new direction. He wanted out of the chaos. But getting out wasn't so simple. Behind the curtain, Hendrix was entangled in one of the most complicated and suspicious management situations in rock history. His finances were murky. His contracts were confusing. And at the center of it all was a figure who would later admit, on record, that keeping Jimi in line meant controlling everything: his schedule, his image, and possibly more. In the last week of his life, Hendrix flew to London hoping for clarity and escape. He was staying at the Samarkand Hotel in Notting Hill with Monica Danman, a woman who claimed to be his fiancée. The timeline of those final hours has always been murky, but what's known is this. On the evening of September 17th, Jimi was seen at a party. He was subdued, not his usual self. He spoke to friends about wanting to get back to America, to start fresh, to start over. But by the next morning, he was gone. Monica said he had taken sleeping pills. The ambulance reports were confusing. The autopsy was rushed. And almost immediately, questions started bubbling beneath the surface. Why did the people closest to him have such conflicting stories? Why were certain details scrubbed from the record? Why were authorities so quick to close the case? For decades, fans accepted the official narrative that he overdosed accidentally, like so many others. But if you look closely at the days leading up to his death, the tension, the desperation, the odd behavior, it starts to feel less like a tragic accident and more like a countdown. A clock quietly ticking towards something inevitable. He was 27. He had just signed new contracts. He had plans for a new album, a new tour, and a new chapter. But someone or something stopped all of it before it even began. And now, with old testimonies resurfacing and never-before-heard interviews coming to light, the story of Jimmy's final days is being retold. Not as a rock star burnout, but as a man trying to break free and never getting the chance. The tragedy of Jimi Hendrix's death was always accepted with a kind of quiet resignation. Another bright light lost too soon, another rock god felled by excess. But what if it wasn't excess that killed him? What if it was intent? In 2009, nearly 40 years after Hendrix's death, a bombshell interview dropped like a thunderclap in the quiet mythology surrounding his legacy. James "Tappy" Wright, a former road manager who worked with Hendrix's label, released a memoir containing a stunning allegation that Hendrix's own manager, Michael Jeffrey, had drunkenly confessed to murdering him. Let that sink in. According to Wright, Jeffrey, who was known for being paranoid, manipulative, and fiercely controlling, allegedly admitted during a night of drinking that he had staged Hendrix's overdose to cash in on a life insurance policy worth millions. In the supposed confession, Jeffrey claimed he filled Hendrix with pills and wine, fully aware that it would kill him. "I had to do it," Wright quotes him as saying. "He was worth more to me dead than alive." It sounds like the plot of a noir thriller, until you realize how disturbingly plausible it actually is. Michael Jeffrey was a former British intelligence officer turned music manager, with rumored ties to underworld figures and a reputation for keeping his artists under lock and key. During Hendrix's career, Jeffrey had been accused of skimming profits, forging documents, and sabotaging Hendrix's attempts to switch management. In fact, at the time of his death, Hendrix was actively trying to sever ties with Jeffrey, something that could have cost the manager millions in lost revenue, and worse, exposed him to legal scrutiny. And here's where the details get even stranger. The autopsy revealed that Hendrix had taken 9 Vesperax sleeping pills, more than enough to knock him out cold, but his blood alcohol level wasn't extraordinarily high. What was odd, however, was the sheer volume of red wine found in his lungs and stomach. Too much to have simply swallowed while passed out. Doctors noted that it looked like the wine had been poured into him after he had lost consciousness. Yet no criminal investigation was ever opened. No toxicology tests beyond the basics were performed. The apartment Hendrix died in was never treated as a potential crime scene. And Jeffrey? He died in a mysterious plane crash just 3 years later, taking whatever secrets he had with him to the grave. Now, with Wright's allegation, fans and researchers began revisiting the timeline. Looking at the inconsistencies in the testimonies, Monica Danman's conflicting accounts, the ambulance driver's odd statements, the contradictory reports from the hospital staff. Piece by piece, the story started to unravel. Why didn't the police investigate Jeffrey more thoroughly? Why did Monica claim to have been with Hendrix all night, when witnesses saw him elsewhere just hours before he died? And why was the music industry so quick to wrap the whole thing in a bow and move on? The idea that Hendrix was killed isn't just tabloid bait anymore. It's a theory backed by motive, means, and mounting circumstantial evidence. It changes the tone of everything, the sadness of his death replaced by something darker, more sinister. This wasn't just the end of a rock legend. It might have been the perfectly timed silencing of a man who was ready to take back control of his music, his message, and his future. And for some, that was a risk worth eliminating. When news of Jimi Hendrix's death broke on the morning of September 18, 1970, it was like the air was sucked out of the music world. Radios went silent. Tour buses pulled over. People cried in the streets. The world had lost more than just a performer. They had lost a symbol of revolution, of raw artistry, of a sound that couldn't be contained by race, genre, or even gravity. For millions of fans, it was unfathomable. Jimi was invincible. He had defied every expectation, every boundary, every label thrown at him. And now, just like that, he was gone. But while the headlines framed his death as yet another rock and roll cautionary tale, the people who truly knew him weren't convinced. Not right away. Not ever. His friends, fellow musicians, and even family members quietly questioned the narrative, but few dared to speak out. Some were afraid. Others were silenced. The deeper you look into the aftermath of Hendrix's death, the more haunting it becomes, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. No formal investigation, no second autopsy, no cross-examination of the many inconsistencies that surfaced in the hours and days following his death. Authorities in London labeled it an open verdict, a vague term that left the cause of death uncertain, but no foul play investigated. It was an easy out. Too easy. And for his fans, the aftermath was like waking from a dream into a world that had lost its color. Hendrix wasn't just a rock star. He was a voice for the outsiders, the misunderstood, the dreamers who saw the world not for what it was, but what it could be. His guitar didn't just play music. It wept, it screamed, it transcended. And in a decade fractured by war, civil rights struggles, and political upheaval, Hendrix was the rare figure who brought people together in awe. So when he vanished, it wasn't just a death. It was a rupture. In the years that followed, artists tried to carry his torch, but none could burn as brightly. Fans clung to bootlegs and unreleased demos like sacred artifacts. Murals went up. Myths took shape. And still, no answers. Only a gnawing feeling that something had been stolen, and no one was willing to admit it. Perhaps the most heartbreaking reactions came from those who stood closest to him. Noel Redding, his former bandmate, expressed his disbelief in interviews, stating he never believed Hendrix was suicidal or reckless with his health. Kathy Etchingham, a longtime girlfriend, spent years trying to piece together the timeline, convinced something didn't add up. Even Monica Danman, the last person to see him alive, changed her story multiple times, giving different versions of the same night until her own mysterious death in 1996. There was no closure, only questions. And as time passed, Hendrix became a symbol for something much larger. The price of genius, the danger of power in the wrong hands, and the eerie pattern of young artists who died just as they begin to challenge the system around them. The 27 Club, Cobain, Winehouse, Morrison, Joplin. They all followed Hendrix. But Hendrix was first. He was the blueprint for brilliance extinguished too soon. And if the theories are true, if his death was orchestrated, planned, or even just allowed to happen, then it forces us to confront a painful truth, that in a world driven by money, control, and image, even a soul as vibrant as Jimi Hendrix's wasn't safe. He didn't go quietly. He left behind sound waves that still ripple through every riff and solo today. But the silence that followed his final breath, that was deafening. And it still is. By now, the official story, that Jimi Hendrix died from choking on his own vomit after a night of drinking and sleeping pills, feels more like a cover page than the whole book. Over the decades, fans, journalists, biographers, and former insiders have tried to read between the lines. What they've found: a web of strange behavior, conflicting accounts, and unanswered questions thick enough to fuel multiple, competing theories, each with its own smoking gun. Let's start with the one that rattled the foundation, the manager murder theory. As we mentioned earlier, James "Tappy" Wright claimed in 2009 that Hendrix's manager, Michael Jeffrey, confessed to orchestrating his death for financial gain. Jeffrey allegedly took out a life insurance policy on Hendrix, one that he alone could collect, and feared Hendrix was about to leave him for a new manager. That meant losing control, losing money, and possibly facing legal heat over shady financial dealings. If Wright's confession is true, then Hendrix didn't die by accident. He was targeted, silenced, dosed, and drowned in red wine. A kill that looked like an overdose but was far more calculated. And it might have worked if Jeffrey hadn't died in a suspicious plane crash just 3 years later. No investigation ever held him accountable. No lawsuit ever followed. Case closed, or more accurately, buried. But that's just one theory. Another, more systemic theory points toward the intelligence community. Sound extreme? Maybe. But let's not forget that Michael Jeffrey was a former military intelligence officer, and Hendrix wasn't just a rock star. He was a countercultural icon with a global following, a black artist gaining radical influence during a time of major civil unrest. He had performed for anti-war rallies. He talked about revolution. He scared the establishment, not just with volume, but with vision. There are whispers in conspiracy circles that Hendrix may have been monitored, and that removing him wasn't just about profit, it was about control. This theory leans into CONTLPRO, the FBI's real, documented campaign to disrupt black activists and counterculture figures during the 60s and 70s. Hendrix didn't fit neatly into any political mold, but that might have made him more dangerous, less predictable, harder to contain. The idea here is that someone made sure his influence ended before it crossed a line. Then there's the Monica Damon theory, the woman who claimed to be Hendrix's fiancée and was with him the night he died. Her story changed over time. First, she said they spent a quiet evening together. Then she claimed they argued. Later, she suggested others had come and gone from the apartment that night. In one interview, she said she left Hendrix alone for just a short time before returning to find him unconscious. But in another, she said she was there the whole time. Witnesses say they saw her behaving strangely. Some claim she delayed calling an ambulance. Others suggest she may have been manipulated or even threatened into keeping quiet. Was she simply confused and traumatized, or was she covering for something? There's also the botched rescue theory, which suggests Hendrix might have been savable if paramedics hadn't mishandled the scene. According to ambulance workers, Hendrix's body was cold when they arrived, and he was covered in red wine. Medical staff later said they were surprised at the amount of fluid in his lungs and stomach, far more than could be accounted for by drinking. Some experts now say that proper intervention might have saved him if help had been called earlier, but whether the delay was accidental or deliberate is the haunting question. Finally, we have the tragic burnout theory, the one the public was fed. That Hendrix, overworked and overwhelmed, self-medicated into oblivion. It's the neatest version, the one that sells box sets and memorial t-shirts without too many questions. It paints Hendrix as doomed from the start, just another 27 Club member who flew too close to the sun. But that version doesn't sit well with the people who knew him. Hendrix had just signed new deals. He was planning a new tour. He had a new band forming. He was done with being a puppet and was on the brink of finally owning his future for the first time. He wasn't winding down. He was winding up. And that's what makes all these theories so unsettling. Whether it was a manager's betrayal, a political silencing, a lover's lie, or an avoidable medical failure, none of them point to inevitability. They all point to one devastating truth. Jimi Hendrix didn't have to die, and if that's the case, someone made sure he did. So, what really happened to Jimi Hendrix? Was it a fatal mix of sleeping pills and red wine, taken by a man worn down by fame? Was it an accidental death that could have been prevented? If someone had called for help sooner, if someone had cared enough to stay? Or was it something darker? Something orchestrated? Something planned? Here's what we know. Jimi Hendrix was at the peak of his power. He had survived the machine of the music industry long enough to start asking hard questions about contracts, ownership, money, and manipulation. He wanted his art back, his life back, and the moment he reached for it, he vanished. Here's what else we know. The stories didn't match. The timelines didn't align. The people closest to him contradicted themselves, disappeared from public view, or, in some cases, died under strange circumstances. Evidence was never fully collected. Leads were never followed. The case was left open, then quietly forgotten. For decades, fans have mourned him like a lost prophet, lionized, immortalized, and slowly sanitized into a brand. But somewhere beneath the posters and the box sets and the grainy footage of Woodstock, there's still a gaping hole, a missing piece, a truth that's never been fully acknowledged. Because maybe Hendrix didn't just die. Maybe he was taken. And if that's true, then his death isn't just a rock and roll tragedy. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when power and profit collide with genius. About how easy it is to rewrite a legacy when the people who hold the pen are the same ones who benefit from the silence. So the real question isn't just what happened to Jimi Hendrix. It's why no one was ever held accountable. It's why a man with so much to say was silenced just as he was about to speak for himself. And it's why, more than 50 years later, people are still whispering about that night in London, wondering what really went down, and who knew more than they let on. Because until the truth is fully told, Hendrix's final note hasn't played yet. And maybe it never will. But here's your part. The story isn't over. It's waiting for someone to dig deeper, to ask louder, to stop accepting the version we were handed. If you think there's more to it, and let's be honest, you know there is, then say something. Share this. Start the conversation again. Because if Hendrix was silenced, it's on all of us to make sure his truth doesn't stay buried.